This week we're carrying on with the map gen improvements, aiming to fix some of the weird things that have been in the game for quite a while. Finally, I'm starting to see some of the improvements for the map gen system that took me ages to write, but it is really great to see all that stuff coming together. This is a game about exploration and discovery in a large procedurally generated high fantasy world. You discover things, collect items, kill monsters, and I've got to say I am really glad to be getting back to the map gen work because I do think this is the sort of thing that makes the gameplay actually quite fun. By far the most annoying bug that was fixed this week was the issue with the desert biome, as I've now managed to fix this altitude problem with all of the sine waves. So what I normally do is apply a nice little effect to the top of the desert to give it the effect of sand dunes. The problem though was at the edges it just looked completely wrong. In order to fix this I had to calculate the distance from each voxel for their respective regions, so I had something to actually blend it against. And with all that calculated, I can now just apply a gradual transition to give it a nice blend, and it looks way better. This did mean though that I had to be a bit more aggressive about making sure region edges were actually correct. Otherwise I'd just start to get some more weird bugs. So this does mean I have to duplicate some steps in the map gen system, which kind of does slow it down a bit, but that's not too bad. So that was that. The next thing is that I've averaged out the floor area when places actually get placed in the world. So this helps to prevent them from being like weird when they're on the hills and that sort of thing. Now the reason it used to look like that was because I had like a separate bit for my C++ pipeline, and then I'd like tack the script onto the end that actually determined where the places were going to go. So what that meant was that you might just end up with a place placed on like a really weird altitude, and it just kind of didn't really look like it really fitted. So what I've now got instead is the ability to determine where places should go in scripts, and then actually modify the altitude around that. So essentially all I really do is just sample every coordinate in a grid depending on how big the place is, and then average that out, and then set every coordinate in that grid to be that average again. And what I'm also doing is I'm also including like a dither factor. So maybe I'll have like 5 other voxels on the outside, and I'll gradually transition back into what the original voxel would have been outside of the average to just help blend it a bit better, so it's not such a jarring edge. The other interesting thing about this is it does make it quite obvious in the undiscovered bits of terrain where places actually are. But you know, I do kind of like that, because as much as it does kind of look a bit unusual, I think it is good if you can kind of predict where things are going to be. So I think for now I'm probably just going to leave that in. So the next thing now, talking about the grounds where places are going to be, I've started work on a system which will allow me to write voxel values through the actual terrain floor. So the goal ideally is that I'd be able to draw some stuff onto like the terrain floor with the scene editor, and then kind of like transplant that into the world itself. So this would allow me to draw things like paths, I don't know, gravel floor, different types of grass or something like that. Now what that would then allow me to do is just have a lot more flexibility in how things actually look. So you can sort of see this working here with the graveyard, where I'm essentially just drawing sand beneath it. This is all defined in a text file, and hopefully the same system should work for altitude as well. Again, I'll just kind of need to get all the logic in the editor to actually be able to deal with this stuff. And this is another great thing that I can do with my new map gen system, because I couldn't have done that before. I added a flag to the Voxil Buffer which will allow me to basically just set it as not applicable for placing things like trees. So what I used to do was write all of the trees, or like placed items, so like cactuses as well, that sort of thing, into a big buffer that could then be indexed by their X and Y coordinate. Now the reason I did that was because then it would be extra efficient to do lookups, to do things like remove all of the trees for places. So say I wanted to go in a grid and just get rid of the trees for wherever a town was, so they wouldn't be colliding. That was how I used to do it. I can just like mark the voxel as don't place anything on it, and then it can just be skipped entirely. So there's no need to create a buffer, there's no need to check the buffer. All you've got to do is check the voxel value when you're already looping through them to place the trees anyway. I fixed some issues relating to the Dustmite Nest from the other week. Do you remember I was talking about how I managed to get it set into the ground properly? Now that was cool, but it was also like my first attempt at doing it. Now the problem was that the way I did that was that I actually dropped the altitude, rather than like coming up with some other weird, more creative solution to do that. Now the problem with that was that sometimes the player could do things like clip into it. Now the other problem with that was that it didn't really account for the fact that you could also see the ocean clipping through the bottom of the nest, because it hadn't really got rid of drawing that bit of ocean. So the way I got around that was by defining a specific flag for certain voxels, which would allow you to skip the drawing the vertices basically entirely. So for certain faces you could just get rid of them. Now one of the problems I had with the previous Dustmite Nest approach was that you could actually see obviously in a map where the hole actually was, because it was just a hole in the terrain. So the way I've done this now as well means that the actual removal of the vertices can be done entirely in the shader. So what I instead do is, in case of invisible terrain, I just ignore the check entirely, and then the voxels draw as they would previously. What it will essentially do is just some vertice stuff in the vertex shader to drop the faces like massively, so they're totally out of view and you'll never be able to see them. And that means that it gives the illusion of there being a hole in place. So that fixed that other problem, because then you also won't get the issue of the altitude clipping, which is great. Now, the other problem I had is obviously that you can see the ocean clipping through the bottom of the nest. So I really wanted to try and get rid of that. Now, my attempt this week, which was unsuccessful unfortunately, was to define some alpha values in the water texture itself, so that in certain cases it would blend it and just discard the pixels, so they wouldn't be drawn. Now the problem with this was that I've also got my line drawing algorithm, which annoyingly wasn't fooled by any of this. And the reason for that was that when drawing the water mesh, even though the pixels had actually been skipped, it hadn't skipped writing to the depth buffer. So what this then essentially meant was that when the system came to draw the texture where all the line drawing takes place, it just sort of clipped the bottom values off, and then it just ends up drawing a nest with a line around it, which is really sad. Now, after having some time to think that over, I don't really think there actually is a simple solution to that. The solution to this, I think, will be switch my water mesh thing to be created on the CPU as a mesh, and then also have a bit of logic to be able to like punch a hole into it. So like remove the actual vertices of a certain area and just kind of carry on like that. So like figure out which bits need to have the hole drawn into it and then like find some way to connect them up, and it's going to be complicated. But what that would mean is that you would then essentially skip entirely actually trying to draw the vertices that are messing up the depth buffer, right? Now that would be ideal, and conveniently in this day and age, I've also got AI to write this whole thing for me. So hopefully that one won't be too complicated to solve. I'm just going to do it next week because I ran out of time. I did manage to get quite a few other things done this week, so I'll just rapid fire them off for you. I spent most of Monday, other than editing the video, experimenting with the frame rate problems I'm having on some of the other devices. Now, I do think this isn't necessarily a GPU bottleneck thing. I think there is something else going on there, because most of these devices start to choke out around 45 frames a second, and I don't really know why. So one of the things I experimented with was disabling VSync, just to see what that would do. So the AV engine now supports a flag where you can just disable VSync, and I was testing that on a bunch of different devices. But still haven't found the root problem of that, so I think I'm going to continue investigating that in secret. And I've also got this fun little marker system in the MapGen client where you can define like a step by a name and then just query it later on. Now this was because one of the things I realized was that when I define my script steps, I do it with like an integer, and I'm just like stick it in this index of the array. But then if the index of the array changes, I'd often forget to update that. So there was some problems relating to that. That was again one of these things where I'm like, oh, I have to do all this work to do this like one simple thing. But actually now I've got it in place, I do like it, and I think it's going to save me from like blowing my leg off at some point in future as well. So yeah, I'm quite pleased with that. So that's it for this week. There actually is quite a lot of stuff happening, and I'm really pleased to see like a lot of the stuff I spent ages writing for the MapGen system actually coming into effect. So I think next week I'm going to focus a bit on the editor tools so that I'm actually able to edit terrain within the tool. And to be honest, I probably just want to start adding some more places and just seeing what I can get in the world, because that is what this game is about, right? Other than the adventure, because we're all on an adventure at the end of the day. So I'll see you next week, hopefully.